96% voted yes. That's the official number Britain published in 1921, when it asked Iraqis whether they accepted the king it had already chosen for them. Have you ever seen a free vote produce a number like that? Almost everything you think you know about Iraq comes from the same source as that number. That it's an ancient country, that Sunni and Shia have always been at each other's throats, that the chaos there is simply nobody's fault. 5 myths. I'm going to take all 5 apart, because Iraq wasn't born, Iraq was built, and it was built for oil. Starting with the night the oil arrived, October 1927, northern Iraq, 3 o'clock in the morning. A British drilling crew is asleep in the desert near a place the locals call Baba Gurgur, Father of Fire. They've been drilling for weeks, nothing. Dry hole after dry hole. Then the ground starts to scream. Men wake up to a sound like a train coming through the camp. A column of oil blasts out of the well, straight through the top of the derrick, 40 meters into the black sky. It doesn't stop. It runs for 10 days. 95,000 barrels a day pouring into the desert, filling the wadis, threatening to poison the rivers. Villages have to be cleared. The crew builds earth dams by hand to hold back a river of oil. And in London, a very small group of men look at the telegram and understand that everything has worked. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about that oil field. The country it was sitting in, Iraq, was 6 years old. 6. It had a king who wasn't from there, a parliament that answered to a foreign capital, borders that had been argued over in European conference rooms, and a name that, until recently, had been more of a geographic expression than a nation. So how does a country that barely exists end up sitting on one of the largest oil discoveries on Earth, with the profits flowing to companies registered in London and Paris? Coincidence? Or was that the entire point? Over the next half hour, I'm going to walk you through one of the most consequential engineering projects of the 20th century. Not a dam, not a railway, a country, designed on paper, assembled from parts that did not fit, held together by air power, and handed a king chosen the way you'd choose a piece of furniture. The men who built it knew exactly what they were doing in the short term. What they did not know, or did not care about, was what they were leaving behind. Because the fault lines they drew in the 1920s are the same fault lines that cracked open in 1958, in 1980, in 1991, in 2003, and in the years after that. This isn't a story about ancient hatreds. This is a story about a decision. Let's go find out who made it. Myth number 1, that Iraq is an ancient country. Start with the strangest fact in this entire story. Before the First World War, there was no Iraq. Not as a state, not as a government, not as a flag or a passport or an army. The word existed. Arab geographers had used al-Iraq for centuries to describe the lowlands of the Tigris and Euphrates. But it wasn't a country, it was a region, like saying the Midwest. What actually existed was 3 Ottoman provinces, 3 vilayets: Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, Basra in the south. And here's what matters. They were not 3 slices of the same cake. They were 3 different worlds. Mosul in the north looked toward Anatolia. Large Kurdish population, a people with their own language entirely unrelated to Arabic, and their own strong sense of themselves. Plus Turkmen, Assyrian Christians, Yazidis. Its trade and its culture pointed north and east. Baghdad, in the center, was the old imperial city, an Arab Sunni administrative elite running things, mixed with a huge Jewish community that at points made up something close to 1/3 of the city's population, along with Christians and Shia neighborhoods. Basra, in the south, was a port. It looked at the Gulf, it looked at India, and its hinterland was overwhelmingly Shia Arab, tribal, rural, and connected to the shrine cities of Najaf and Karbala, which answered to religious authorities who had never much cared what Istanbul thought. Different languages, different sects, different economies, different directions of travel. Ottoman administrators had governed them separately for a reason. Separate governors, separate tax systems, because that's what actually worked. Ask yourself honestly, if you were designing a stable country from scratch, would you glue those 3 together? But there was one thing running underneath all 3, Not culture, not religion, not language. Geology. Underneath that awkward triangle sat one of the greatest concentrations of petroleum on the planet. And by the early 1900s, oilmen and geologists and imperial civil servants had a fairly good idea that it was down there. Seepages had been burning at Baba Gurgur for so long that the locals treated the flames as eternal. Bitumen had been traded out of Mesopotamia since Babylon. This wasn't a secret. It was a rumor with very good evidence behind it. So when Iraq gets assembled after the war, the shape of it is not an accident. Look at a map of Iraq today, and then look at where the oil is. North, Kirkuk. South, Basra. The state that was drawn manages to include both and to swallow the Kurdish north, which had no interest whatsoever in being ruled from Baghdad. Which raises the obvious question: why would an empire 9,000 kilometers away want a piece of desert this badly? To answer that, we go back, before the war, before the mandates, to a decision made by one man in London in an office overlooking the Thames. 1911. Winston Churchill is 36 years old, and he's just been made First Lord of the Admiralty. He is responsible for the most powerful navy in the world, the entire foundation of British power. And he inherits a technical argument that senior officers had been having for years. Coal or oil? For a century, the Royal Navy ran on coal. British coal. Dug out of Welsh valleys and Yorkshire pits by British miners. It was secure. It was domestic. Nobody could cut it off. Oil was better in almost every measurable way. More energy per ton, faster acceleration, longer range. You could refuel at sea instead of spending days in port with hundreds of men shoveling coal by hand. But there was one problem, and it was enormous. Britain had coal. Britain had no oil. Not a drop of it in commercial quantity anywhere in the British Isles. So the decision in front of Churchill was this: do you make the world's greatest navy, the thing your entire empire rests on, dependent on a fuel you have to import from someone else's country? He said yes. He committed the Navy to oil. The new Queen Elizabeth-class battleships were designed to burn it exclusively, faster, heavier gunned, and utterly dependent on a substance Britain did not possess. And in his own words, he understood exactly what he'd done. He said the Navy's fuel security could only be found in variety and variety alone, meaning you had to control multiple sources in multiple places so no single enemy could ever turn off the tap. Read that again and translate it out of diplomatic English. It means we now need other people's oil permanently, and we need to control it ourselves. That is the moment the Middle East stops being a distant curiosity for the British Empire and becomes a life support system. The Navy moved fast. In the summer of 1914, weeks before the world caught fire, the British government did something almost unheard of. It bought a controlling stake, 51%, in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Price? £2.2 million. A state buying an oil company to fuel a fleet. That secured Persia. But Persia alone was not variety. And here the story picks up a second character, one most people have never heard of, even though he ended up one of the richest men who ever lived. His name was Calouste Gulbenkian, an Armenian financier born in Istanbul, educated in London, a man with no army, no country, and no oil wells, but an extraordinary understanding of who needed to be in a room together. Gulbenkian's gift was assembly. He put deals together, and he took a slice. In 1912, that talent produced something called the Turkish Petroleum Company. On paper, it was a consortium formed to hunt for oil in Mesopotamia, still Ottoman territory. Behind it stood British interests, Royal Dutch Shell, and Germany's Deutsche Bank, rival empires sitting at the same table, because the prize was worth more than the rivalry. And in March 1914, in London, at the British Foreign Office, which tells you everything about how seriously governments were taking this, the shares were restructured. British interests took the largest slice, Shell took a quarter, Deutsche Bank took a quarter, and Gulbenkian, the fixer, kept 5%. 5% of the oil of Mesopotamia, for the rest of his life. They called him Mr. 5%. He died one of the wealthiest private individuals on the planet. So hold this picture in your mind. It's early 1914. War hasn't started yet. The Ottoman Empire still legally owns this territory, and a company has already been formed, in London, to extract the oil under it. The claim was staked before the shooting started. All that was missing was a way to take the land. Then, in the summer of 1914, an archduke was shot in Sarajevo, and suddenly, Britain had one. Here's where this story gets genuinely dark. Because the Ottoman Empire joined the war on Germany's side, and Britain now needed something specific. It needed Arabs to fight Turks. British troops were dying in France in numbers nobody had imagined. There was no army to spare for a desert campaign. But there were Arab populations across the Ottoman lands who had their own reasons to want the Sultan gone. So Britain made an offer. Between 1915 and 1916, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, exchanged a series of letters with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the guardian of Islam's holiest cities and a man of enormous prestige. The deal, as Hussein understood it, was simple and vast. Rise up against the Ottomans, and Britain will support Arab independence across the Arab lands. An Arab kingdom, their own state. In exchange for blood. Hussein took the deal. In June 1916, the Arab revolt began. His sons led it, including a young man named Faisal. Remember that name because he's about to become the central figure of this entire story. Arab fighters cut Ottoman railways, tied down Turkish divisions, and rode into Damascus. Alongside them was a young British intelligence officer who spoke Arabic, wore Arab dress, and became a legend. T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. And here's what makes Lawrence more than a romantic film character. He knew. While he was riding with those men, telling them they were fighting for their own country, a British diplomat named Mark Sykes and a French diplomat named François-Georges Picot were sitting down with a map of the Middle East and dividing it between their two governments. Signed in May 1916. Secret. Not a word to the Arabs who were, at that exact moment, dying for the opposite outcome. France would get a zone in the north, Syria, Lebanon, and in the original draft, Mosul. Britain would get the south, Baghdad and Basra, and the route to India. Two promises. Same land, both made by the same government. Which kills myth number 2, that Britain arrived in the Middle East as a liberator. It arrived with a signed agreement in a locked drawer that made the liberation impossible. Lawrence later wrote about carrying that knowledge into battle, and it never left him. He described leading men on a false promise, in the bitterest terms a man can use about himself. And then the war ended, and the secret came out. Because the Bolsheviks, having seized the Tsarist archives, published the treaty for the world to read. Imagine being Sharif Hussein and opening a newspaper to discover what your allies had actually agreed. But hold on, because there's a detail here that most retellings skip, and it's the one that proves what this was really about. Under Sykes-Picot, Mosul was supposed to go to France. Mosul is where the oil was. So in December 1918, the war already over, the British Prime Minister Lloyd George met the French Premier Georges Clemenceau in London, and in a conversation that has become famous among historians, Britain asked for Mosul. Clemenceau agreed. Now, why would France simply hand over a province? It didn't. It traded. The bill came due at San Remo on the Italian coast in April 1920. There, the victorious powers carved the Ottoman lands into mandates, legal instruments that, in League of Nations language, meant guiding peoples not yet able to stand by themselves towards self-government. Britain got the mandate for Mesopotamia, full control of the territory that would become Iraq. And in the same week, the two governments signed a separate oil agreement. France gave up its territorial claim to Mosul, and in exchange received 25% of the future company that would pump Mesopotamian crude. The old German share transferred to Paris. Let that land properly. A province with 1 million people living in it was traded for a quarter share in a company. Not one Arab, Kurd, Turkmen, or Assyrian was at that table. Nobody asked the people of Mosul which side of a line they'd like to live on. They found out later, the way you find out the weather. Britain now had the land. It had the legal cover. It had the oil rights. There was only one thing it hadn't planned for. The people who actually lived there had been paying attention, and they had not agreed to any of it. Summer 1920. Word of San Remo spreads through Iraq, and the reaction is not confusion. It's fury, because people had been told they were being liberated from the Ottomans. That's what the leaflets said when British troops entered Baghdad in 1917, that they came as liberators, not conquerors. Then the war ends, and instead of independence, they get a British administration, British political officers, British taxes, and a legal document from Europe explaining that they are not yet able to govern themselves. So they rose. And here comes myth number 3, the big one, that Sunni and Shia have always hated each other and always will. Watch what actually happened in 1920. Sunni and Shia rose together. Shia clerics in Najaf and Karbala issued religious rulings against British rule. Sunni officers and notables in Baghdad joined them. There were joint gatherings during Ramadan where Sunnis prayed in Shia mosques and Shia in Sunni ones, deliberately, as a political statement. Tribes that had feuded for generations coordinated. Kurdish areas rose too. For a few months in 1920, the artificial country actually did have something like a common national feeling. It was directed entirely at the people who were building it. The revolt spread across the Middle Euphrates and burned for months. British and Indian troops were killed in the hundreds, around 1,000 dead on the British side by most accounts. Iraqi deaths ran into the thousands, with estimates ranging widely, into the many thousands. But it wasn't the casualties that decided things in London. It was the invoice. The revolt cost the British Treasury roughly £40 million. To put that in proportion, that was around twice the entire annual budget that had been allocated for Iraq. And Britain in 1920 was broke. It had just spent 4 years bleeding itself white in France. Newspapers began asking, loudly, what British soldiers were dying for in a desert most readers couldn't find on a map. One of the loudest voices was Lawrence himself. He went to the press and wrote that the people of England had been led into a trap in Mesopotamia from which it would be hard to escape with dignity and honor. His own government's project, and he was publicly attacking it. So Whitehall faced a straightforward problem. Keeping Iraq required an army. Armies cost money. There was no money. The solution came from Churchill, by now moving into the Colonial Office, and from the head of the Royal Air Force, Hugh Trenchard. It was called air control. The concept? Stop garrisoning the countryside with infantry. Pull the soldiers back to a few bases. And when a district refuses to pay taxes, or shelters rebels, or defies the administration, don't send a column. Send aircraft. Bomb the village. During the 1920 revolt, the RAF flew thousands of hours and dropped roughly 97 tons of bombs. And it worked, in the narrow sense that matters to an accountant. Air power broke the resistance at a fraction of what infantry would have cost. Within a few years, the annual bill for holding Iraq had fallen dramatically. Trenchard got his Air Force saved from post-war budget cuts. Churchill got his empire on a discount. And a policy was established that would be studied by every Air Force in the world, that you could govern a population from above, by threat, without ever putting a soldier in their street. And then there's the piece of this that people argue about to this day. In 1919, Churchill wrote a War Office memorandum in which he said, in writing, "I am strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes." That quote is real. And I want to be precise with you, because precision is the whole point of doing this properly. Churchill's defenders point out that in the same document, he specified he did not mean the deadliest gases. He wrote about gases that would cause great inconvenience and spread a lively terror, arguing this was more humane than high explosive. And historians continued to debate how far chemical weapons were actually deployed in Mesopotamia versus authorized on paper and never used at scale. But strip away the argument about implementation and look at the sentence itself. The category uncivilized tribes. The assumption that there is a class of human being to whom you may do things you would never do to a European. That assumption is the operating system of this entire story. Everything else, the borders, the king, the concessions, runs on top of it. The revolt was crushed, but it taught London one thing that changed the plan completely. Direct rule was too expensive, too visible, too easy to attack in Parliament. What Britain needed was not a colony, it needed something that looked like a country. March 1921, Cairo. The Semiramis Hotel on the bank of the Nile. 40-odd British officials check in for a conference that will decide the political future of the Middle East. Churchill chairs it. Lawrence is there as an advisor. Percy Cox, the High Commissioner in Baghdad, is there. And so is Gertrude Bell. Bell deserves her own film. Archaeologist, mountaineer, Arabic and Persian speaker, the first woman to take a first in modern history at Oxford. She knew the region's tribes and politics better than almost any Englishman alive, and she was the only woman with real authority in that room. She once wrote to her father that she'd spent a morning at the office drawing the southern desert frontier. 2.5 weeks. When it ended, Iraq had a shape, a policy, and a king. The king was Faisal. Yes, the same Faisal. Sharif Hussein's son, the commander of the Arab revolt, the man Lawrence rode with. And you might think this was Britain finally paying its debt. It wasn't. There's a step in between that explains everything. After the war, Faisal had been made king of Syria by an Arab Congress in Damascus. He lasted about 4 months. In July 1920, the French army marched on Damascus, destroyed his forces at Maysalun, and threw him out. He arrived in Britain, a king without a kingdom. So when London needed a face for Iraq, there was a man available who had exactly the right qualities. Think about what those qualities actually were. He had prestige, Hashemite, descendant of the Prophet, hero of the Arab revolt, real legitimacy in the Arab world. And he had nothing else. He had no power base in Iraq, no tribal network there, no family land, no local following, no army of his own. He came from the Hijaz, hundreds of miles away. There is a story that his Arabic, the polished Hijazi speech of a Sharifian family, sat oddly with the Iraqi dialect around him, and the man had never governed a day in Mesopotamia in his life. He was, in other words, a king with prestige and no independent power, which means he needed Britain to survive every single day. That's not a bug in the plan. That is the plan. Now, you can't simply announce a foreign king. There's a mandate. There's a League of Nations. There's an American president talking about self-determination. It has to look chosen. So Iraq held a referendum in the summer of 1921. And here is myth number 4, the one I opened this video with, that Iraqis chose their own king. Faisal won 96%. 96. Now you know where that number came from. Rival candidates were pushed out of the running before it began. The most prominent alternative figures were exiled or sidelined. The result was announced in August, and on the 23rd of August 1921, Faisal was crowned King of Iraq in Baghdad. British officers stood at the ceremony. A British band played, and, the story goes, played God Save the King, because nobody had yet written an Iraqi anthem. If you wanted one image for this entire episode, that's it. A new nation's coronation, scored by the anthem of the empire that built it. Now the machine could run. In March 1925, the government of Iraq signed the oil concession with the Turkish Petroleum Company. 75 years. Iraq's own subsoil signed away until the year 2000. And look at who owned that company after the shares settled. British interests, Anglo-Persian, Shell, the French, and an American group which had spent years lobbying its way in. Plus, of course, 5% for Gulbenkian. Iraqi ownership? Zero. The Iraqi government's role was to receive a royalty, a fee per ton extracted, with no ownership of the enterprise, no control over how much was pumped, no say in where it was sold or what it was sold for. The decisions about the resource under Iraqi ground were made in boardrooms in Europe. And in 1928, the partners went one step further with the Red Line Agreement, literally drawing a red line on a map around the old Ottoman territories and agreeing that none of them would chase oil inside that line except through the joint company. A cartel, with a map, pledging not to compete for a region's resources. Then came Baba Gurgur, October 1927, the gusher from the opening of this video. 40 meters of crude in the night air. The field at Kirkuk turned out to be one of the largest ever found, the biggest in the world until the Saudi giant Ghawar 2 decades later. The bet, placed in a London office in 1911, had come in. And when the oil began to flow in commercial quantity, it flowed out, through a pipeline built to the Mediterranean, into tankers, into the fuel bunkers of a navy and the economies of Europe. Iraq had a flag. Iraq had a king. Iraq had a parliament, a cabinet, a treaty with Britain, and a seat at the League of Nations in 1932. What Iraq did not have was its own oil. And here's the question that decides the rest of this story. How long can you run a country like that before someone comes to collect? Faisal I died in 1933. Before he died, he wrote something so honest, it's almost painful. He wrote that in Iraq there was still no Iraqi people, but unimaginable masses of human beings devoid of any patriotic idea, absurdly divided, prone to anarchy, and ready to rise against any government at all. The king Britain installed to hold the country together was privately telling his own government that the country did not exist. 25 years later, the bill arrived, July 14th, 1958, Baghdad. Army units are supposed to be moving through the capital on their way to Jordan. Instead, they turn. Officers of a secret group called the Free Officers seize the radio station and announce a revolution. At the Rehab Palace, soldiers arrive early in the morning. The royal family is told to come down into the courtyard. The crown prince gives the order not to resist. They are shot in the courtyard. Among the dead is King Faisal II, grandson of the Faisal who was crowned in 1921. 23 years old, educated at Harrow in England. A marriage was being arranged for him. He had held full powers as king for 5 years. The Prime Minister, Nouri al-Said, was Britain's man in Iraq more than any other, a soldier of the old Arab revolt who had served as Prime Minister again and again across the decades, and who had tied Iraq to Western defense agreements against enormous domestic opposition. He tried to escape Baghdad in disguise, dressed as a woman. He was recognized on the street the next day and shot. His body was buried, and then dug up by a crowd, dragged through the streets of Baghdad, and mutilated. That is the end of the British project in Iraq. Not a treaty, not a handover ceremony, a courtyard and a mob and a body in the street. But this is not where the consequences end. It's where they start. Because think about what the state of Iraq actually was as a machine. A Shia majority in the south, a Sunni Arab minority that had been given the officer corps, the administration, and the political class. A Kurdish population in the north that had wanted its own state since before Iraq existed, and had been told at one point after the war that it might get one, then watched that promise disappear when the oil province was attached to Baghdad instead. Now remove the outside power that was holding it together. What happens? Coup follows coup. 1958, 1963, 1968. each one bringing in men who understood that in a state with no shared national story, the only thing holding the territory together is force, and whoever controls force controls the oil revenue, and whoever controls the oil revenue controls everything. That logic ends in 1979 with Saddam Hussein. The oil had been nationalized in 1972, and he used the revenue to build one of the largest armies in the region. He fought an 8-year war with Iran that killed hundreds of thousands on both sides. He turned chemical weapons on Kurdish civilians at Halabja in 1988. He invaded Kuwait, a neighbor whose own borders were drawn by the same imperial process, in 1990. Then 2003, a foreign invasion, on stated grounds that turned out to be false, dismantles the state apparatus entirely. And the moment the force holding the country together is removed a second time, the same 3 fault lines open in exactly the same places. Sunni insurgency in the center, Shia militias in the south, Kurdish autonomy in the north, with the fight over Kirkuk, the field from our cold open, as one of the bitterest disputes in the country. The same 3 Ottoman provinces, the same lines, 100 years later. So let's close the loop we opened. I asked at the start how a 6-year-old country ended up sitting on one of the great oil fields of the world, with the profits flowing to London and Paris. Now you know it wasn't coincidence. The borders were drawn to enclose the oil. The province containing the oil was traded for a share in a company. The king was chosen for his dependency. The referendum was arranged. The concession was signed for 75 years by a government that Britain had assembled. Every part of it worked exactly as designed. Which brings us to myth number 5, the one that does the most damage. That the chaos in the Middle East is simply nobody's fault, that it's just how that part of the world is. When you hear that the Middle East is unstable because of ancient hatreds, because these people have always fought, remember 1920. Remember Sunni and Shia praying in each other's mosques to organize a rebellion against a foreign administration. That happened. Those groups were capable of common cause. What they were not capable of surviving was a state designed to prevent it, a state where power was handed to a minority because a minority is easier to manage, where the majority was excluded from the start, where a distinct people in the north was locked inside borders they never accepted because their mountains sat on top of a hydrocarbon reserve. The instability of modern Iraq is not ancient, it's not genetic, and it's not inevitable. It was engineered. In a hotel in Cairo, in a conference room in San Remo, in an office at the British Foreign Office in March 1914, by intelligent men who are not evil in any cartoon sense, and who are solving a real problem. How do you fuel a navy when you have no oil? And who simply decided that the people living on top of the answer did not get a vote. That decision has now outlived every single person who made it, and it is still running. If this changed how you look at a map, do me one favor: subscribe. This channel exists to take the stories that get compressed into one line in a textbook and open them all the way up. And the algorithm only shows this to people who aren't here yet if you hit that button. Hit the like button too, and tell me in the comments which of the 5 myths you'd been carrying around without knowing it. The ancient country, the liberation, the eternal hatred, the free vote, or the chaos that's nobody's fault. And if you want the next one, Britain and France drew another line in this same period. That one produced a country nobody expected to survive in a war that hasn't really ended. That story's coming next. Thanks for watching.